game-changing discussions on the big ideas that shape our thinking. This is One-to-One.
Hello and welcome to One-to-One. Previously on the show, my guest today argued that foreign policy is only as strong as the domestic order beneath it, that Africa must learn more urgently to do more for itself, and that Nigeria still carries a historic responsibility to lead the continent. But the world has shifted further and faster. Power is being redistributed, the global order is under strain, and across Africa, questions of sovereignty, legitimacy, and state capacity have become harder, not easier. Professor Eghosa Osaghae is Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs. Professor Osaghae, welcome back to One-to-One.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for joining us. Welcome back. I'd like to hear directly from you. What in your view has changed the most since you were last here? The world itself, Africa's position within it, or Nigeria's ability to respond to this rapidly changing world?
Now, I think that what has changed the most, and hasn't really changed in that sense, is that America has become a lot more assertive. America has become the fulcrum, of all of the things that are happening in global relations. So just think of it, whether it's the continuing war in Ukraine, which had a different trajectory after President Trump, came into office and has tried to see how he can navigate through from the back door to change the face of that war. Or the war in Gaza, which also took the world, someplace else, and ending with President Trump's efforts at creating a new peace alliance, or even the continued problems in the Middle East, the engagements with Iran over its nuclear involvements that have led us to this war. But also at the same time, not forgetting the forgotten wars in Africa. The fact that Sudan is still, where it is getting worse by the day. The fact that Somalia, has remained, deep in those recesses. The fact that we've had problems in the Sahel and, in the Congo, all kinds of things. And in other parts of the world, we've had problems in Haiti. It remains, largely unresolved, and so on. But more directly to the point is the kinds of things we have seen of American action in Venezuela, for instance, the kinds of things we have seen in America's overtures or threats over Greenland, over Canada itself, and so on. Yeah. The increasing fragmentation of world alliances and those blocks that have historically defined the world's, configurations.
Talk to me about Africa's position in amongst all of this, and more to the point, how Nigeria is positioned or is responding as the world is on roller skates.
Well, the first thing is in terms of the determinism, of all of this, the forces pushing them, they are beyond Africa. And, they have left Africa at the margins because I said a little bit about the forgotten wars in Africa that we ourselves are not really able to do much about. But these global events that, have characterized and defined the world in the last 12 months and so on, have happened outside of Africa, and very little of it is African. in provocation and in content. So what has happened?
We are affected by them.
We are affected by them, nonetheless, because we are the receiving end of, global occurrences.
Absolutely. So have we lost our agency in all of that?
It's not about agency. The whole world, is redefining agency in the light of what America has become. You would see that, even in Europe itself, there are talks of, agency under review. So it's not an African thing. But what it just means is that, Africa is becoming even more marginalized. And sometimes we get thrown into these situations because at the United Nations, for instance, there's a lobby to see who's on your side and who's not on your side. And that's when Africa comes alive. But the truth is, Africa has always insisted that for weaker portions of the world, it is the multilateral platforms that must take preeminence. And so the United Nations has to stand up. I mean, whether it is the war in Ukraine or it is the war in Iran and the Middle East and so on, the United Nations is the holding port for Africa and for Nigeria and so on. And that's why we have concentrated on those alliances and the kinds of forces that we can exert through them. The United Nations is very key to that.
But I'd like to bring this conversation home to Nigeria, just for a few moments, going forward. I'll read to you one of the statements you made during our last conversation, which you and I completely agreed upon. You said then that foreign policy reflects domestic strength. Absolutely. So my question is this. When Nigeria engages externally at the highest levels, for example, recent high-level engagements with countries like the United Kingdom, very high-profile state visits, what should we be looking for as evidence of that strength in our domestic and foreign policy?
What do we see as our problem? Because when we look at the connection between domestic policy and foreign policy, we're saying, how can foreign policy be articulated and pursued in a manner that can help you address domestic challenges? Poverty is a major problem. The existential challenges that people face, employment, infrastructure, transportation, you see, those very basic things, housing, food security, name them.
These collectively undermine foreign policy credibility.
No, they don't. They push, for the determination of what your foreign policy goals will be. So, for instance, government has identified economic diplomacy as one of the platforms for responding to these domestic challenges. What does that mean? We have been a trade outpost dealing only with import and export. Now, but there is a very clear target today that, like, Poland, like Singapore, we want to become a $1 trillion economy. Now, that is not an ambition that is born out of the prestige of just becoming, a $1 trillion economy. It's an ambition that is born out of having a comprehensive way to address our domestic challenges. So, for instance, there's talk about upgrading our port facilities, and that is infrastructural renewal. For a long time, the Western perspective of foreign aid and technical assistance was criticized for its emptiness. We'll talk about how much money is committed and so on. But the concrete deliverables and the things that can be immediately seen
Yes.
were always missing until the Chinese came. The Chinese have the Belt and Roads Initiative, the BRI. And from all of the meetings, they call them FOCAC, all those meetings that they've had with Africa over the years, the emphasis has been on infrastructural renewal. So you go around everywhere, we still take loans and those facilities, but they are committed to concrete deliverables. So in Nigeria, for instance, you can talk about the rails, you can talk about the airports, you can talk about the roads, you can talk. Now, so the West got challenged, the Western donors, and those forms of support, to say, for so long, we've had packages, that talk about all of these things, but the people cannot directly and immediately see what they amount to. So the ports deal is a direct response to that challenge. To say, here we are. I mean, if you go around our roads in Nigeria, you will find sukuk. Now, that's a concrete evidence, of something that has come from foreign support. So these are the kinds of things that we're talking about. And, what our economic diplomacy has meant is first that we want to expand and diversify our trade. For so long, it's been oil and gas. Now, Nigeria is moving in other directions, not just only for commodities, but also for industrial goods. We must become a manufacturing hub. We must add value, to the so-called raw materials that we have. So it's no longer simply a point where you have instruments to take crude oil and, export that crude. Today, there's a game changer in town. We have the Dangote refinery. And today, even countries that are industrialized are looking to the refinery, and so on. So this is the kind of thing that we're talking about. And if we get the foundations right, through the forms of not just investment, but the attraction, of those investments that would make Nigeria itself a manufacturing and industrial hub, so that we can expand our productive capacities.
Of course.
So we're not just simply consuming what we don't produce. We want to, become a productive hub. And that is a new line of what we are pursuing as a country. And it's a deliberate thing. And one mark of this deliberateness is to see the double and multi-track approach that involves bringing the private sector into our economic diplomacy. And that's, the introduction of the private sector and other non-state actors, not only diversifies the scope of what we're doing, but also, has a way of mutually reinforcing those interconnections.
Absolutely. And, economic diplomacy is hugely important. And we've just been talking about the strength of the domestic arrangements and how that impacts upon the strength of foreign policy presentation. So I'd like to come back again and use the state visit as a fantastic example of that. I believe it's the first in close to 40 years.
Yes, you're right.
It's a historic event. And naturally, one would expect that given the strength of our foreign policy position, partly aspirational, but we're moving along, hopefully as we would expect to progress. I would like you to walk me through, begin to unpick for me what benefits you expect that, given our strong foreign policy position, to accrue to us over time as a direct result of that visit.
Well, the more difficult bits to unpack would be the intangible benefits. You know, there are benefits that come from status, for instance, that you would not begin to imagine. If your status is a high status, you don't spend too much energy convincing people about the things to do.
Sure.
If you have a national prestige, for soft power diplomacy, that's the kind of thing that you need. But that also talks about your credibility.
Yes, of course.
Now, image, the perception that people have of you, these are intangible things, but they are very fundamental.
Of course.
You know, so if you look at Nigeria on the world stage of a state visit on the invitation of the King of the United Kingdom.
That's huge.
It's very huge.
Yes.
And those intangibles then begin to add together.
Correct.
Now, what they can bring would be far, far more than what the immediate tangible delivery would be.
And I'd like us to talk about what they can bring or what they will bring over the course of perhaps 10, 20 years.
Even in the immediate short run.
Absolutely. So walk me through that.
Can I get a little dramatic?
Of course.
So somebody is seeing the Nigerian president and he says, oh yes, that may have been a forgotten country. So, I mean, to be on the world stage at this level means that there's probably something new happening to Nigeria.
Which is why we're having the conversation.
This is one of the greatest benefits that you can get from such a visit. I mean, you know, and then you follow through the kinds of things, you know, you ask questions. So what's happening to Nigeria? Nigeria is very great and so on. And then you look at the Nigerian diaspora in the United Kingdom. For the UK itself, it must be one of the most strategically, you know, positioned diasporas outside of the Indian and the Asian diaspora. The African diaspora led by the Nigerian diaspora is very key. And this is strong. So the president's visit is a reenactment. It's a reminder, you know, of those kinds of things, just in case you have forgotten what they are.
Yes.
But in addition to that, you know, Nigeria is a very clear West African and African leader. So it means that you can have Nigerian diplomatic channels to address problems outside of Nigeria in Africa. So if you have good offices with Nigeria, you can deal with matters in other countries. And that in itself would not be immediately visible because these are back channels, you know, that are going on. But in terms of the things that we can see, the more conspicuous, elements of these kinds of benefits that you're talking about, the banking industry, the Nigerian banking industry, has become very, very, strategically important in the United Kingdom. And I think around the period the president was visiting was when one of the banks was creating a huge branch in Manchester. Now, tie that to the forays, the exploits, the very great, significant, presence that that Nigerian banks have across Africa. So there's a multiplier effect that comes when you then have more banks going to the United Kingdom and therefore into other parts of Europe. There's a multiplier effect that would not immediately be obvious, but you will see as we go on. And in terms of the kinds of investments that the government has, government is marketing Nigeria and saying these are the opportunities, that are on offer. And the president's visit is to reassure investors that we're dealing with a country that has greater stability today than we ever had.
So, Professor Osaghae, I think it's fair to say that the United Kingdom and Nigeria share a long and very interesting history. It is, without a doubt, the right moment, of course, for us to reframe the relationship and be very clear-eyed about the mutual benefits that that we can derive from one another as partners and from the partnership. So that was a historic state visit, and I'm sure that that there's more to hear about that in due course. So can I ask,
Yes.
Professor Osaghae, I mean, we've spoken historically quite a lot. I'm a student of history, and they say that we are constituted by our history. The question I'd like to ask first is this. Would you say that Nigeria's present stature in terms of leadership in Africa is constructed by or within the historical value that it has to the region?
Well, the point about leadership and power and status, it's about the historical foundations that you have for those connotations. Leadership is a accumulation, of things that you have done over the several years. Leadership is about the ability and the resilience you have shown in a variety of situations and circumstances, many of them very challenging, that you are up to it, that you can be relied upon, that you can, stand up to be counted. And this is the one area where Nigeria has been consistent. I mean, across West Africa, across Africa, the reputation that Nigeria enjoys is the one of a very bold leadership. And, you don't respond to things, outside of what they call for. In other words, there is, there's a way you respond to things based on the specificities of the dynamics of that particular situation. For instance, people say, oh, now there's something going on in Gaza. Why is Nigeria not speaking up? Now, things just don't work like that. When Nigeria is challenged to provide leadership, it does so. And I think that is one thing that hasn't changed at all in Africa. I was saying that when you talk about substance and memory, you forget that what is common to memory and to substance is proven ability. The fact that every time there's been such a challenge, Nigeria has lived up to
How
it.
about current and consistent execution, not just capacity, but actually execution?
No, well, in relation to what?
So let me ask the question this way. There is no doubt Nigeria is hugely respected for what we have done, rightly so,
And for what we are doing.
and for what we're so I'd like us to pick up on what we are doing, which is hugely important. And you are in a fantastic position to educate me on that. So if Nigeria is leading today, I'd like to ask, just very crisply, what is the basis of that leadership today? Economic strength? Institutional capacity?
Those are instruments.
Diplomatic influence?
Those are instruments.
Military weight?
Those are instruments. Those instruments are very fundamental to who we are. Nigeria is one of Africa's biggest economies. At a point, we were the biggest economy.
Correct.
Nigeria is Africa's biggest democracy. That is incontrovertible. Nigeria has the largest population in Africa.
It does.
People say 1 of every 3 or 4 Africans is a Nigerian. Nigeria has, a science and technology space, that is proven and well respected.
Hence the
in terms.
expectation.
Yeah, no, wait a minute. We're talking of instruments, But these expectations haven't been born out of what we have done. For instance, in the area of peacekeeping operations, in the past, whether it was in Congo or it was in Liberia or in the present, Nigeria is Africa's biggest contributor to peacekeeping operations, which is why at a point when the United Nations itself needed to have something close to the office of the force commander that was, regarded as institutional, the first person that was considered was a Nigerian general. So peacekeeping operations, Nigeria is there and is a respected leader in Africa.
Nigeria is the largest contributor to that. Is tangible.
Yeah, so yes, and you can think of all the other things. Now, let me also tell you that even in West Africa, there are countries that have periods of emergency.
Yes.
When Nigeria comes, to assist. And that continues till 2026. And that's going on. I'm sure at some points you would have heard of the pivotal role of Nigeria's electricity grid, in Togo and in Niger. Now, so if you're looking for concrete things, that's one. But think today of going through the major capitals, in Africa and seeing Nigerian banks all over the place.
Correct.
That's proven.
Sure.
Now, there are payment platforms outside of SWIFT, that Nigerian banks have developed for intra-African trade. That's concrete. Today in Zambia, there's talk about Dangote in Ethiopia. These are concrete examples of what we're doing. Now, across West Africa, there are Nigerian construction companies that are also becoming involved. These are concrete things. So I think that there's a paradigm shift that we have to identify. Conventional wisdom looks only on the state and what government does. Neoliberal wisdom talks about the private sector and non-state actors. So the days when everything started and ended with the state, those days are over.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if you look at the airspace, the aviation industry across West Africa, if you take out Air Peace and Aero, and now new players like Ibom Air and so on, you can fly across West Africa. Now, but that's Nigeria. Right. And this is not Nigeria Airways. Yeah. These are Nigerian Airlines, doing these bits and pieces.
So I'd like us, therefore, to broaden it a little bit. There is no doubt about Nigeria's stature in Africa, hence the expectation. And we are doing quite a lot, as you said. But of course, we can compare ourselves with ourselves. But I'd like us to broaden it. And you touched on some other African countries, many of them quite small compared with Nigeria. I'd like to force a comparison here. Which African countries, in your judgment, are behaving strategically in this direction in terms of influence and leadership, apart from Nigeria?
Well, I'm sure that you can count a few of them. South Africa would, be on top of this. But remember that South Africa's own foundations, are very exceptional in that regard. That for a long time in Africa south of the Sahara, South Africa was the one country that had a very solid industrial base. It was an industrialized society, had a very strong military and defense sector, had a strong mining sector, but most of all, had an economy that was very productive. from within. And don't forget that at the point of a transition from apartheid, South Africa had also developed nuclear technology. So South Africa was in a very different, climb altogether. And therefore, you would expect that there will be continuity. Of course, there's change, but there's continuity from that foundation. And once you've had an industrial base, it's difficult to deindustrialize, for instance. So industrialization also means that your approach to strategic planning is different. Because when you become such a strong industrialized country, you are then thinking a little more rationally about how things, affect, themselves and so on. Now, but outside of South Africa, you can think of Egypt, which is, another old civilization that goes back to the era of the pyramids and so on. You can think of Ethiopia. These are historic civilizations that are not new to nation building and development and so on. Now, in that regard, I'm sure that students of comparative politics must rate Nigeria very highly. Because we don't have the historical coherence that many of these countries that I've mentioned had. We don't have the industrial advantage that a country like South Africa has. We don't have the productive capacities that some of these countries had, and unfortunately these things have also affected the directions and trajectories of foreign direct investment. For instance, many of the major car producing manufacturing companies have plants in South Africa, in Morocco, and in Egypt. Morocco produces parts for Rolls-Royce, domestic production for Rolls-Royce. Now, these are very strong industrial bases.
Yes.
But we are getting there. The point is, who would ever have thought 30 years ago that we'll be at a point where we have the capacity to refine petroleum products? The derivatives, from that one industry, would see them. Or that we have capacity to produce cement, or we have capacity to generate electricity in a diversified manner. Now, all of these things are happening because we have a reform process that is saying the state might be the leader, but it's not the only actor.
So have we just woken up after 30 years in that case?
In the past 30 years or in the future 30 years?
But now, with the reform agenda, have we woken up?
There's always room for a new foundation. And I think, that we will be failing as a country if we don't review, all the things that we've been doing. That's the dynamic part of planning, and especially strategic planning. And it's not different with Nigeria. I mean, we have to sit all the time, to look at where we are coming from and where we want to be. And then we can recalibrate and reconfigure and do things and so on. But, I'm saying, we are also self-conscious. We're self-conscious of the fact that other countries in Africa are also desirous of these leadership roles that we are playing. And that, we must jealously guard those advantages that we have.
So, Prof, I'd like you to hold that comparison in your head just for a minute, and let's recalibrate in this conversation. Just to be clear, in leadership terms, in terms of our discussion about leadership within Africa, what we're defining as strategic here is clear priorities, consistent execution, alignment, your words, of domestic and foreign policy. I'd like you to now reattempt that comparison.
Well, I mean, the point is, at any point in time, a country has to do a determination of its national standing and how that affects its external posture. Nigeria has had domestic challenges. You will remember that up until the 1970s, those domestic challenges took the major form of very serious divisions within the country. It was a time when, as a country, we had Nigeria ambassador in one country. We also had ambassadors from the Western region, from the Eastern region, and from the Northern region. Those forms of division were divisions of an international, a primitive international order. Now today, we don't have those kinds of divisions anymore. The challenges are a little more cross-cutting. They are economic, mostly. They are existential. These are serious problems, even of survival challenges. Poverty is very key. And therefore, the kind of foreign policy that we can pursue today must be the one that is capable of addressing these existential problems. We must deal with poverty.
Yes.
And the best way to deal with poverty is to have productive capacities, is to think of income distribution and redistribution, is to think of forms of social justice. All of these things will require economic empowerment. And government is saying, this is not something that we can do alone. We need a very robust private sector, and we need foreign investment. How do you make this place, attractive for even domestic private sector investment? And this is the whole point. I mean, we must create an enabling environment, the ease of doing business, the kinds of reforms that we are doing, the infrastructural support that you would need. But most of all, we are also aware that if we don't make this place safe and secure, we would at best have investors that come with their suitcases. So we don't want portfolio investors. We want, portfolio meaning that they come with, their portfolio of money and so on. We want investors that will come here and make this a productive base. And that's the whole point. So if we want to summarize what we're doing, how our domestic forces have compelled our foreign policy postures, that's clearly the thing. That we must solve our problems. And as I say, it was easier to do when you were politicking and trying to see how you could balance forces in the 60s, 70s, and so on. So if one side said, no, we don't support, what is happening in this part of the Middle East, another part says no, so you could have those kinds of dissensions. But today, there is agreement that if this country doesn't get it right economically, if we don't deal with poverty and insecurity, we are not going to get anywhere.
Correct. And I think you've hit the nail on the head here. The sum total, the summary, the balance of this argument really is that, yes, we've had a trajectory. We're not denying where we are or where we've come from. There's learning there. There's a reform agenda. That's great. But the thrust of our foreign policy agenda is domestic.
Yes, it's very
that's the focus, and that it all makes sense. And let's look at the broader context. Let's look at the world in the context of what's been happening in Russia and Ukraine, in the Middle East. The world appears to be hardening along the lines of power and interest. And you spoke earlier about a condensation and a constriction. What does that mean for countries with a policy of non-alignment? Is that strategic ambiguity tenable in this day and age, given what we now know the world is becoming?
I think that conceptually there's been a shift from whether you call it constructive or positive non-alignment to strategic autonomy. The point about strategic autonomy is that as much as is possible, every state, but especially the more vulnerable and weaker states, want to be able to take actions that serve their national interests. So they are not led by the nose by other countries. It's a form of non-alignment, but it's more discerning. It simply says we have to be strategically autonomous. But that comes with a different, framework. Strategic autonomy means you must build your own, autonomy.
Absolutely.
From within.
Absolutely.
It means that you must, reduce the degree of your dependence. It means that, you must be able to do a lot of the things on your own.
Yeah, exert your agency at the very highest level.
Very good. Now, that becomes a policy goal as well as an instrument. So where we are today, the world is pushing everyone to the point of degrees of strategic autonomy. You are not responsible for the war in Ukraine, but the war affects you nonetheless.
Yes.
You don't know so much about the war in Iran, but see where every person is.
Absolutely.
A long time ago, we would have thought of strategic reserves and those kinds of things. Countries, responding differently because it's a war on the world. It's by other means. Yes. We wouldn't call it a world war, but it's affecting everyone. Yeah. And so in some countries now, they have decided to reduce working days, work from home. There are now quotas. You can't buy more than X liters of petrol and so on. We're all responding differently. But I think this is pushing all of us to see that we cannot be isolationists. Yeah. We cannot undermine the multilateral platforms. The forces of the things that bind us together and, make us collectively vulnerable are greater than the forces that make for individual interests and so on.
But where does this leave a previously non-aligned country while it's on that journey to strategic autonomy?
The point is, you must not forget that non-alignment had an ideological basis.
Correct, yes. The world is changing, is what we accept.
Many of the things that we face today are not so ideologically driven.
Yeah, correct.
So you can be pragmatically non-aligned, meaning you are not for Ukraine, you are not for... but there cannot be a consistency along those lines because the things that, provoke these outbursts and the conflicts that we have don't follow very clear lines. Today, it's difficult to tell what exactly is at play. Is it the fact that Iran, is an aspirant nuclear power, even though Iran says we're already, in talks, how to get to good ends for all of us, and then this happens. So it's difficult to tell. But the point is that for Nigeria and for Africa and for the rest of the world that is at the very devastating receiving end, of these kinds of wars.
Of course.
We have to push, for ceasefire, for end of war, and for the return of a rules-based system and strong multilateralism.
So let's talk about how Africa has adapted, therefore, or is adapting. You suggested previously in our earlier conversation, I love referring to that conversation, that the West is becoming less reliable and that new powers were emerging. And we've spoken a lot about multilateralism here today. My question is this: has Africa adjusted fast enough to that reality? Or what is the evidence of a coordinated strategy to ensure we adapt properly?
You know, this is a very difficult contemplation. Africa is not one country.
Correct.
Africa is a country, is a continent of 54 sovereign states. 54. And these 54 states are not equal. There are different levels of development, they face different challenges and so on. So, at best, theoretically, you can have an African response at the level where Africa is able to call the world to order and have a voice in these kinds of conflicts and push for peaceful resolution. But it is individual countries that have to respond, to the threats that are posed. For instance, petrol is very expensive all over now. There cannot be an African solution to that because Africa doesn't produce oil.
Of course.
So
let's boil it down to the level of African states, therefore. So when African states engage with China, the US, Europe, the Gulf, India, for example, is that strategic? Of course, it's strategic, but it's sometimes opportunistic as well. My question is this: what distinguishes the strategic from the mere opportunism? We know what's going on, for example, now in the Strait of Hormuz. 20% of the world's oil. There's an opportunity for African states, including Nigeria. How do we make the distinction in the response between what is purely opportunistic and what is a coherent strategic response?
Remember the circumstances that led to the formation of OPEC. Now, here are oil-producing countries, and the question is, how do we make the best of this crisis?
Right.
So they got together to say, maybe our best way forward is to see that we can control the prices. And that's what OPEC has been doing.
Yeah.
Now, so in terms of, how those kinds of things can happen, we have to look at the opportunities. Now, it is difficult for Nigeria to act alone, at a time like this. Yes, we produce oil and so on, but that's very infinitesimal, what we produce. In fact, today, we also depend on imports, which means that we are almost as exposed as, non-oil producing countries are. Now, these are global threats that require collective, efforts at addressing them. So this is not the time for individual countries to act alone. No one can be a champion of anything. It's the ability that they have to align forces with other countries and respond in a manner of a common interest-based, platform.
Which makes sense in this conversation, therefore, to pivot back to Africa.
Well, Africa is not an oil-producing country.
Indeed.
Africa is not an oil-producing region. There are a few African countries, you can count them. More are getting oil now. But I think, one of the lessons to learn from this, there was a time African oil-producing countries tried to get a parallel OPEC. The African oil-producing countries had a platform, but it hasn't worked. Now we have critical minerals across Africa.
Of course.
In Zimbabwe, in Zambia, in Rwanda, in Congo, in Nigeria, in Mali, in Niger. This is a time to get together. And I can tell you, these kinds of experiences that we are having now would push us more and more into making Africa more strategically autonomous. And look at this one. You know that one of the tragedies of resource mobilization in Africa is that our geological maps are not up to date. The geological maps that we use go back to colonial times in places to the 1920s and 1930s. So it is people who come from outside that are able to tell you, you have these resources, which you are not aware of. So it is time to build capacities to see how we can, all of us, work out frameworks, technological frameworks, geological frameworks that can help us do these things on a collective scale.
And that's not happening yet, is it?
We are too divided, and we don't have the resources to do so.
I'm right up there with you with the high optimism. And I think you're absolutely right. The greater point here is that there is work to be done if we're looking into a future like that. So here's my question, therefore. What would need to change in this country, concretely, not rhetorically, okay, in the next 5 years, for you to say Nigeria is ready to assume the pole position that we all wanted to have in Africa?
If we have a strong defense industry, for instance, and it is something we can build from our present experience with insecurity. If we build a strong defense industry, then we'll replace oil and gas. If we build a strong service industry, a financial sector that is very strong, we'll replace oil and gas. And so the whole point about diversification of the economy is precisely about that. Now, think again what great assets we have when you have a Nigerian who's Director General of the WTO. When you have Nigerians, in such top positions. The Comptroller General of the Nigerian Customs is the chairman of the World Council of Customs. Now, those are, strategic positions that can be used, to arrive at, So what I'm saying is we can have those strategic deployments, but we must still give room for the unforeseens and the unknowns that sometimes become even more consequential. Suppose this war in Iran were to last for another 6 months. All of the plannings that we are talking about would come to naught. Because the first thing that you have to assume when you plan is that there's an ongoing society. There's a reasonable degree of stability, and so on. But where those things are not possible, then you have a problem. So I think the first thing is how to make our country more stable, how to stabilize the country. And that's what we're doing. And we think that, if we have an economic mainstay that can boost our productive capacities and enable us to get the right approaches to distribution, that would address poverty and so on, we have a good foundation.
So, Prof, one of the things I recall you saying, the last time we sat together, was that citizens relate to the state opportunistically, which is a very interesting statement, very true, in fact, particularly in this part of the world. But here's my question. To what extent is that a response or learned behavior from the state itself?
Now, to properly understand this, you have to get to the understanding of ownership. So who owns the state? If we have a sense of collective ownership, that would lead to a sense of a communality, where a threat to one is a threat to all. If you take little things like how we approach issues of security in our neighborhoods, the fact that we all know who the criminals are, but we would not go and report them. It just shows that, hey, we have an inverse sense of responsibility. Now, all of that are manifestations of the deficits of ownership of the state. Now, ownership comes when you are able to have a sense of what affects me affects everyone, and therefore, and so on. So, to some extent, it's an unresolved crisis because the state has not demonstrated, its responsibility to everyone on an equal basis. People see there's relative deprivation, there's marginalization, there's exclusion. It's not simply and only in economic terms or class terms or ethnic terms. It's what we see. You go to a marketplace and you just find that men and women are not treated equally. You go to some place and find that people who are physically challenged they don't belong. You go to some place and find that young people, this is not a place for you. Those forms, and so on. And yet, we all face the same problems. So if we can get to a reasonable level of collective ownership, then we can begin to think differently. If somebody steals what we all own, the anger would go round. It's not going to depend on where you come from. Absolutely. So it's someplace we must get to.
Absolutely. I mean, World War II, England, people were being hanged for relatively minor offenses because the country was in wartime measures, rations. And
it didn't make it right.
It didn't make it right.
Yeah, but
not at all. But yes, there was that perhaps hyper-acute sense of collective ownership. But here's my question. Let's take, for example, let's use tax compliance as an example. Beautiful example of what you've just said. Sense of ownership. Tax compliance is low. The general excuse is, well, I don't see what the state is doing with my tax. But of course, Africa needs to grow up, doesn't it?
No, but let me just quickly respond in the following way. There's a famous maxim in America, no taxation without representation, saying that there is an accountability default line that comes with taxation. That's one. The second thing is rational theory itself that says, why should I pay tax? This is the theory of public goods. How does it work? Now, I drove from the office to this place, and nobody was carrying a placard to say to me, have you paid your tax? So it means that, I'm free. It's free lunch for me. So I can travel from here to Kano to Calabar and so on without paying tax, and nobody is going to stop me.
Where there's no law, there's no sin.
No, that's not the point. Therefore, a rational person would say, why should I pay tax when I can enjoy all of these things for free? So when you're going to get a scholarship, my child is very brilliant, nobody is going to say, show that your parents have paid taxes. So every person is on a free lunch. Now, the same rational theory then says, the way to do it, perhaps, is to incentivize people, to woo them. We're dealing with human beings, and it's a universal tendency. It's not in Nigerian or African. How do we incentivize people? How do we show them that it is in their interest to pay tax? So, you begin by saying, if you are very poor, you don't pay tax at all.
Exempt.
In countries like Sweden, They say if you cross a threshold of income, we'll tax you 50%. It doesn't matter whatever you say. If you earn 100,000 kroner a month, 50,000 goes into tax. Because it's a welfarist system that says those who work for themselves and those that are unemployed. Now, so those are, progressive ways of dealing with taxation issues. Here, we must not forget the history of where we are coming from with taxation. So we'll go back to the colonial foundations of these forms of what you might consider irresponsible behavior. In colonial times, those who led the nationalist movements were telling the people that it is a crime to pay tax. And we are assuring you that when we take over, you won't pay tax again. Now, it is precisely because that was the mindset that, was popularized, that people saw tax collectors as oppressors. They will run from them. They will not pay tax. And when we're caught then in the contradictions of the fact that it's not a crime, you must actually pay tax. Government doesn't have any mysterious source of revenue. It's tax that people pay. Then they started to say, okay, well, if you have 10 children, we can give you some reliefs. If you have this, just prove this and so on. So what was promoted and encouraged was a perception of tax as something that, you really didn't, is wickedness of government. It's evil on the part of government. So we're encouraged to lie in our tax, returns. We're encouraged to see if we could, make the best of things that were not right. And yet, today, this is the challenge of reforms. How do you tell the same people now, it's attitude change and the conversion, that, it's actually your civic responsibility. It's part of your citizenship that you must pay tax. Now, how do you incentivize? You see, and I've seen it. There were state governments in this country before that had, even here in Lagos, see what your taxes are doing for you. So you put on the highways. Look, if you go around Lagos, the quality, the state of public schools, primary and secondary, very high quality. Many of them make private schools look ordinary. If the people know that these things are coming from tax, and let me tell you, for a long time, there's been this Nigerian mentality. There's money in Nigeria. And when people tell you that, they mean money in government. So this is idle money. And when you say, where does this money come from? They say, well, we have oil, we have gas. But the truth is that the little that we get from oil and gas is the little we get from taxation on this sense. There are rents that are paid. Of course. Now, so people have to understand. And that's why I think, we are doing better than we used to do in terms of educating people on the meaning of taxation, what it does for you, and so on. Government doesn't have any money. The wealth of government is taxes that people pay. So I think that we still need to hold those who manage our revenues, more accountable. There must be, those things. So we change from Nigeria has money, to that money is our money. Yeah. And once we understand that, so we move from the boundaries of strict rational presumptions that say, oh, is it my money that will change government, to saying, yes, it's my money. It's my money. Without me, this government cannot survive. Once we get to that position, then we'll say, no taxation without accountability. So when people say, oh, they have stolen billions, they say it's of our money. Not money that you cannot think of. It's of money that you have paid by way of tax. So people don't go there and find idle money. It's our money, our collective patrimony. That's what people are stealing, and we must stop them from doing that.
So a sense of collective ownership.
Yes, yes.
Weak states, opportunistic behavior. It's a continuous feedback loop.
It's a way of addressing such opportunism. How does opportunistic behavior, come into being? The state is not fair to me. And I know that there are people who go there, the country is very rich. It's just to get the opportunity to get close to, government, and then I will take my share of the national cake. Now, that's very opportunistic.
Yes.
Yeah, but once you begin to have a consciousness of the fact that whatever the country has comes from me, and that's it tells you entire story.
Professor Osaghae, as the Director General of the Nigerian Institute of International Affairs, you are right in the middle of much of what is going on the foreign policy front in this country. You have a bird's eye view, I would say, of the entire thing. We've talked a lot here about how Nigeria and Africa ought to position itself, the geopolitical shifts that have occurred since our last meeting here 12 months ago. Can you tell me, from your point of view, from your particular vantage point, how is the NIIA positioning itself to support and assist this agenda that we've spoken about here today?
Well, know that the NIIA is the federal government's think tank and advisory on foreign policy and international affairs, which means that the NIIA has a responsibility to engage very robustly in not only discourses, but how those discourses can translate into positioning the federal government on the right track. And I think the NIIA has consciously gone about this mandate and has, driven the best that it can to make us where we are. The point I should make is foreign policy is not always about post hoc responses, meaning that foreign policy is more forward-looking and anticipatory, because once you are able to define what your priorities are, then you can navigate through processes. And therefore, the things that we see as, these are surprises and so on, become easier to deal with once you have the necessary tools to anticipate and know how to deal with them. One of the things that we have canvassed all the time is to have what we call strategic foresighting. It's a tool, that must be used.
Professor Eghosa Osaghae, thank you for joining me again on One-to-One.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Pleasure.